Greetings and welcome back to our study on becoming God's people. This week we are in Genesis chapter 12. My reflection for the week is on the call of Abram in Genesis chapter 12, the first 9 verses. You can read that. The link is provided in the notes. But a little bit of background information, because these videos are more about, or at least I'm hoping that they become more about the background information than the actual reflection on the story. So background to Genesis chapter 12. We saw previously in Genesis 11 that the people who were building the Tower of Babel were trying to make a name for themselves. They were trying to make themselves great, and they were doing so by staying where they were when God had told them to move or asked them to move. They stayed put. They were not covering the earth the way that God kind of wanted them to. They were creating a tower, an edifice for themselves that was going to show their power and their dominance. And in fact, in some ways, was meant to be a little bit of a controlling influence on God. We are going to build God's dwelling and not let God assign a dwelling. That was kind of their mentality. These people became proud and arrogant, and because of that, they were eventually subdued. They were brought down. And we're kind of left with this question: is God just going to allow humanity to act over and over again without intervening? Is God just waiting for humanity to fumble the ball so badly that there's nothing God can do and destruction is imminent? Or is God going to take control of the situation in some way and kind of preemptively work with humanity? And that's part of the rationale, that's part of the mentality behind the first 11 chapters of Genesis, is to show not so much God not intervening, but to show where humanity, left to its own devices, would go. How humanity, it was not just a fluke that humanity got so bad that the flood happens. That is their pattern. And if God does not intervene in some way and cut this off at the source, humanity will repeat the process. And so Genesis 12 and the calling of Abraham is, in some ways, God intervening before the necessity of destruction. This is God nipping the human cycle of destruction in the bud and calling out a person. And notice, it's not just any person. It is in some ways the exact opposite of the people who build the Tower of Babel. The people who build the Tower of Babel are powerful people who are trying to control an area. They were a group that were in some ways homogeneous and controlling. Abraham comes from a family that left Babel. They left Babylon. They left that area, the Chaldees, and moved west. They moved away from that civilization. Abram's father moves along this path of leaving behind the pattern of Babylon and beginning something new. They have no structure, they have no settlement, they have no kinship. There is nothing tying them to this land. That is a vulnerable situation in the time frame. When this story takes place, everything revolved around kinship structures. If you did not have family in your area, you didn't have really anybody. You didn't have a social structure. There was no social hierarchy to help you if you didn't have other people. Unlike today, where we have societal government resources established for people who are new to areas to help them accommodate themselves and assimilate themselves to some degree. In that time, if you did not have kin, if you did not have family, structures, well, you had nothing. You had no name. You had no recognition. You had no help when you needed it. You were just isolated. And so, contrasting the people of Babel, who are trying to build the name for themselves and seize it, we see God calling out this one individual away from his homeland, and in fact, away from even the place where his father has settled, which was not his ancestral homeland. So Abram is now 2 steps removed from his ancestral homeland and is establishing himself in a brand new locality that even his father did not know. Not only that, Abram is walking away from every person who is able to protect and help him. He is isolating himself. Yes, he brings Lot along with him when God says, leave all of your kindred. Not because that's a literal command that Abraham must leave everybody who's connected to him, but what God is saying in those words is leave behind every social structure that can benefit you. Everybody who can help you, leave them behind. Take only the people who are dependent on you. Lot being the we're guessing here a little bit, but the not quite mature son of Abram's deceased brother would have probably not been considered in many ways a head of household. Abraham probably, while Lot would have technically owned all of his dad's estates and inheritance, which, animals, maybe some slaves, people, Lot would have owned all that. But Abram would have been the one who controlled it day to day, would have worked on behalf of Lot. At least that's what the text kind of implies. So Abram is taking Lot along with him, not because he has to leave every family connection, but because he has to leave all of the connections that can benefit him. God is calling him to a place of complete dependence in an area where he is going to be an alien and a stranger. When he goes to the land that God will allow him to see, I love that translation of the land that I will show you. It is literally the land that I will help you to see. When God takes him there, it is about having no other person that Abraham can depend on. Even Abraham's descendants, the reason they're not to make treaties with the people of the land is as much because they are to depend on God for their protection as anything. This is a sign that they are going to depend on God and that God is going to be the one who protects them. So Abram at this point leaves his homeland, the land where his father has settled, and goes. And I love this. There's a 7-part comment from God. There are 7 clauses in God's comment to Abram. This is, again, a sign of completion. It is a sign of purpose and promise to have 7 clauses. And they break down in a way that shows protection and promise and blessing. Abram will prosper. He will be a great nation, but it only comes through God. It doesn't come through his hard work. It doesn't come through his ingenuity. It doesn't come through any of the attributes that we typically in modern America want to associate with success. It is simply God. It is simply because Abram trusts God and walks with God. And I think that is a wonderful statement for us. Further, Abraham is called not simply to be this great people, but to be the great people in order to bless others. This is a somewhat difficult concept here because the Hebrew here is a little bit weird. It's difficult to say if Abraham is supposed to be the blessing or if people will just be blessed by knowing Abraham, or if they bless themselves through Abraham. It's a little bit convoluted, but the general theme is that the people who work with Abraham are inherently working with God, and the people who want to harm Abraham are inherently working against God. And the people who work with Abram will find their blessing in and through God because they showed kindness to Abram, the resident alien and stranger, because they went outside of their kinship bonds and helped somebody who simply needed help, somebody who could not necessarily pay them back, somebody who could not necessarily help them in the long run, somebody who was in need. They help, and so they inherit a blessing also. And the people who do want to harm Abraham are going to find that there is no blessing for them. It's not that God will come in and arbitrarily bring destruction to them. There's two separate words here in the curse language. The people who harm Abram will find themselves under a curse. Again, this is not necessarily God being active in destruction. Rather, the people who fail to bless Abram, who want to seek him harm, will find that that kind of lifestyle works against them. It works contrary to them. And that is what God wants Abram to see. Not that Abram is superior, but this is more about lifestyle, where this one person is chosen to lead and walk away from everything, and the other people are meant to respond in love and generosity in a way that is Christ-like. And that's kind of where the reflection goes, so I don't really want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. You can read that. But that's the kind of the backdrop to what Abram does. And then he goes off to this new land, which he doesn't know, and he doesn't speak. He doesn't actually talk. He doesn't actually say anything. He just follows quietly. And I think there's a lot that we can learn in just following quietly. I say that as somebody who talks for a living. It's a little bit more difficult. But there is so much we can learn by just following God quietly and allowing circumstances to come as they do. We can also see that in Abram's wanderings, he goes to places that are culturally religious. He stops in a couple of places and builds altars. And this is very intriguing to me, that Abram would stop at places that are known as ritually symbolic sites. These are places where many, many people encounter the divine. They encounter God. And the Bible it has no condemnation for Abram stopping at places that are just considered sacred sites, not explicitly sacred to the one God. They're just generically considered sacred. And at that point, erecting altars to his God. And I think in our world, we as Christians, sometimes we don't meditate on that long enough. I think that one of the things that we should meditate on is the fact that Abram doesn't just go found arbitrary sites where God speaks specifically to him and set up altars there. No, Abram goes to places where God is known to speak, or in maybe even if we were to understand a polytheistic culture where gods speak, and there looks for encounters with God. In other words, what I get out of all of that is Abram intentionally sanctifies places that are religious. He doesn't seek to destroy the things that other people find sacred. Instead, he goes there and he finds brand new meaning in worshiping the one true God. He takes what everybody else considers good and makes it better. He takes what everybody else considers sacred and gives it new, extended purpose that has a whole life on its own. These sites that he goes to become traditional sites in Israel of worship. These are places where people go for generations to worship. They come up repeatedly in the text. And I think there's something to that we don't often consider. But he does this, Abram does this in going from top to bottom throughout all of what will become Israel. And at the end of this section, he's in the Negev, which is the southern kind of dry, arid, deserty place, the southern border of Israel. And he's preparing himself he's seen the whole land, and he's preparing himself to, in some ways, take possession of it. But the text doesn't stop there. It immediately and kind of abruptly transitions from Abram in the land doing exactly what God tells him to do, to Abram going down to Egypt. And we're left with this question of, why does Abram go down to Egypt, and why does he just really quickly seemingly fall away from what God has told him to do? These are real deep questions, and they should spark within us curiosity, and they should help us to understand not just this is what God wants for us, but that God's working with a very flawed individual who doesn't completely understand what's going on. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've been the deeply flawed individual who doesn't completely understand what's going on. And Abram walks away from the land that God has promised, walks through it all the way to a place that becomes synonymous with sin and death and slavery, and there fails to trust God. And we're left with this understanding that overcoming human sin is going to take a long time. It's not as easy as God just speaking to a person, because Abram has multiple encounters with God and yet still walks through the land all the way to Egypt, and there shows remarkably little trust in God, at least until the end of the story. And so what I'm left to ponder, and what I'm left to think is, well, maybe I'm like that. Maybe I'm like Abram, who is called to walk to a certain point, trust, and I keep walking in my own intelligence and in my own wisdom, and I make God's plans all the harder because I can't listen and follow. I start trying to take things into my own hands, and bad things end up happening. And that's something that I've been forced to wrestle with. And I hope you take some time to meditate on that too. As always, if there are any questions or comments, please let me know. I'll try to get to them. I'll try to make videos or in some way acknowledge them and discuss them. And until we meet again, God bless.